I was born in Argentina, which is a wonderful and great country, but unfortunately, we have a lot of macroeconomic problems. And one of the most terrible and pervasive problems is inflation, which is the persistent increase in the aggregate price level. Now, I learned about the importance of inflation as a young kid. I was only 10 years old in 1989 when the country went through a massive period of hyperinflation, a very high inflation level. In fact, in March of that year, the monthly inflation rate went from 17% to just over 190% in July. That meant that prices were tripling in a month. And the annual inflation rate for that year ended up being 20,000%. Prices were rising so fast that everyone's lives was affected. In fact, I remember how my mother would go to the bank every single day. I thought she worked at the bank. And she would do that to exchange the australes, which is the local currency, into dollars in a desperate attempt to get rid of the australes and preserve the value of her family's savings and our family's income, just as all Argentines were doing at the time. And then she would only keep enough australes in her pockets to be able to make the purchases of the day. We would go to the supermarkets and nothing would even have a price because prices were changing so quickly that the retailers wouldn't even bother posting them. Instead, they gave people at the cash register an updated list of prices every few minutes. And as customers, we had to hurry up to make sure we got there before prices rose. People spent so much time trying to adjust to inflation that the economy suffered tremendously and everyone's lives was greatly affected. It had a very big impact on the way Argentines perceive inflation and the problems of inflation. Now, it should be to no one's surprise then that approximately 15 years later, in 2004, 2005, when the inflation rate started to rise once again, a lot of people got worried. Particularly when the annual inflation rate went over 10%, the government became very concerned. Most governments around the world, when they see inflation rising, they usually ask the central bank to cool down the economy, raise interest rates, so that the inflation rate falls. But that means that the economy is cooling down and it's not a very popular policy to pursue. And the government of Argentina wanted to do things differently. They said, well, why don't we talk to the people responsible for computing this number and see if we can change the way we measure the inflation rate, which was a disaster because it created a second additional problem. Not only we had an inflation rate that was rising, but also we couldn't, from then on, be sure what the real and actual inflation rate was. Now, the way inflation is measured around the world is roughly the same. There's a statistical agency that sends people to the physical stores. They go, they write down the prices of all the goods that a normal consumer typically buys, and then they calculate the percentage change over time of a basket of goods. That's the inflation rate. So one of the first things the government of Argentina apparently tried to do at this time was to find out where they were collecting the data so they could go and pressure the retailers to keep their prices fixed, to which the National Statistical Agency said, no, that's a statistical secret, as it is in every country, precisely because we want to avoid any bias in the index. And the government still forced them to do a lot of methodological changes, which were never really fully disclosed. But the inflation rate started to stabilize. And eventually they even fired the people responsible for computing the index at the National Statistical Agency. And that's when the official inflation rate went below 10% and has been like that for a very, very long period of time. Now, one thing happened here. When inflation goes above a certain level, particularly 10%, people start to notice it in the prices that they see at the stores, just like it had happened to me in 1989. And if you ask people, like University of Ditela did in Argentina, they put on this survey where they asked people how much they felt the inflation rate was, they would reply with numbers that were much higher than what the government was showing. They said inflation was over 20% and the government was only recognizing 10% of that. So a lot of people started to get suspicious about the official numbers, but nobody really knew what was going on. Because if we really want to measure inflation well, we need a reliable data source that can provide information on a very wide range of goods and consumer prices. That type of data didn't exist at the time, because only the government had the resources to pursue such a large-scale data collection effort. But I had a very simple idea. Why don't we use online data? Now, I was a PhD student at the time, and I had already noticed for my thesis work that a lot of the largest retailers in Argentina were posting information and prices of every single good that they sold on their websites. And I realized if we can tap into this source of information, if we can reliably collect this data over time, then I would have a very simple and low-cost way to measure inflation and compare it to the government's numbers and try to understand what was going on. The technology to collect data, all this data online, is actually very simple to understand. Behind every website that has information about prices, there's a very structured language called the HTML code, which basically tells the browser that we use how to display the information graphically on the page. Now, this language is formed by these tags that identify where each relevant piece of information lies on the page. And I realized I could teach a software to recognize each of those tags, collect the information between them, and store it in a database. It was a lot of work initially to customize the software. But once it was done, I could let it run automatically every single night. And over a period of a few months, I had amassed a huge amount of data for every single good that was sold by the largest retailers in Argentina. And I had the daily prices for each one of these goods. So I could build my own inflation statistics using the methodology and the equations that the government was supposed to be using, just with a different source of data. And what I found was strikingly different from the official numbers. This comes from a paper I wrote in 2012 in the Journal of Monetary Economics. And the black line shows the price index produced by the government of Argentina. And it's normalized to 100, the aggregate price level in the economy. And what the black line is showing you is that after a period of 4 years, the price level in Argentina had risen approximately 35%, according to government numbers. Now, when I repeated the exercise with online data, I found that the increase was over 100%. Prices had more than doubled in that time period. And this divergence was very persistent over time. It was not a matter of just a few months, but it lasted for many, many, many years. It was extremely puzzling, but very important to understand why it was so different, because the slope of this line is essentially telling you is what is the inflation rate. And if you use the official numbers, the inflation rate in the country, according to the government, was only 8.5%. But with the online data, I was getting numbers close to 20%, which is, by the way, what people felt that the inflation rate appeared to be, and it was consistent with other estimates produced by provincial governments and other economists. The magnitude, though, of the difference is not proof of anything. Maybe I was using a different data source that had different inflation rates, and there was something in the way I was measuring the inflation rate that was different. So the first thing I tried to understand the difference was to replicate the methodology in other countries of Latin America and see if I got similar or different results in those countries. And no matter where I looked, whether it was Venezuela, which had an inflation rate of almost 30%, or I went to Chile that had a very low inflation rate of 3%, the results I would get with online data and the methodology I was using was very similar to the official results. The only exception was Argentina. So I wondered, maybe the data I'm using for Argentina is different, or can I find a way to replicate the official numbers? The next thing I tried was alter the data source choose a different retailer to produce my index. That didn't really change results much, and there was still a huge difference with the official index. I also tried methodological changes and even just focusing on a very special subset of goods. The government at that time was imposing price controls on a set of goods that they considered important. And a price control is essentially a maximum price that those goods are allowed to be sold. And for a time, no retailer could offer them at higher prices. The goal was to try to dampen the inflation rate. And in fact, I did find that during short periods of time, the inflation rate of those goods was much lower. But then as soon as those goods were no longer in a price control, they would increase very quickly and catch up to the previous trend. So overall, if you think of the slope of this line as being the inflation rate, it was much higher, again, than the official numbers. There was essentially no way to replicate the official estimates, except for one. The only way I could replicate it was with a very simple algorithm or mathematical solution, which just simply divide by 3. When I did that, I got numbers that were extremely similar to the government. Eventually, everyone realized that Argentina was manipulating the price index. First, Argentines themselves, normal people, businesses, and even the local media in Argentina, as this article from a Nación newspaper showed in 2008, everyone realized the official numbers could no longer be trusted, and they stopped using it. Eventually, global media organizations like The Economist magazine, which stopped in 2012 the publication of official indices and replaced them actually with data that we were producing already at the time. And finally, even multilateral organizations like the IMF, to which Argentina belongs, that decided that statistics being produced by the government could no longer be trusted. For Argentina, all this process with the price index was tremendously hurtful in terms of its economic impact. It undermined the stability of our economy, introduced a lot of uncertainty, consumer confidence dropped, and investment confidence dropped, which will affect our growth potential for many years to come. And it's a trend that will be very hard to reverse, because it's very easy to lose trust in a statistic like this and very hard to regain it. But there's a bright side, and this is beyond the simple case of Argentina. We realized that online data and these new technologies provided a reliable source of information for the measurement of inflation. A source of information that had advantages that went beyond just being able to produce alternative indices in a country that manipulated it, like the case of Argentina. Even if we focused in an economy like the US, where inflation is correctly measured, we could produce statistics that had significant advantages on many dimensions. What are those dimensions? Well, first of all, we could dramatically lower the cost of collecting all this data. And by doing so, we could not only liberate resources for the statistical agency to apply them elsewhere, but we could also dramatically improve the accessibility of this type of information. Anyone could collect data now. It could be someone like I was in 2007, a graduate student with an old laptop, to any firm that wanted to produce their own statistic, to even the government. We could move also from having to rely on small baskets of goods that are carefully selected, but they're still small, to be collecting data for every single good that is being sold out there. And as soon as a new goods appeared on the stores and the preferences of consumers changed, we could start collecting information on those goods and creating these dynamic baskets that can better capture the important inflation trends an economy is experiencing. And finally, we could do this much faster. We could go and produce this almost in real time. And with that objective in mind, we created this project we called the Billion Prices Project at MIT Sloan. And it's an academic initiative geared towards using all these new sources of information to improve economic research. But we had a very practical goal back then, which was see if we could experiment and innovate in the way inflation could be measured in real time. And we started with the US economy. We collected data here from 2008 to 2010, and in 2010 we produced an inflation index using online data. And here, what we found was very different from Argentina, first of all. The index tracked or co-moved very closely with the one being produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the official agency in charge of this in the US. But our index had a big advantage. We could produce it very quickly, post it online, and it was very effective at detecting these particular moments in time when there's a big change in the trend of inflation that can have dramatic consequences for policymakers or businesses that have to make decisions. In particular, for example, in September of 2008, when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt in the US, some of the largest retailers in the country started very quickly dropping their prices in anticipation probably or an expected drop in demand. Now, our index picked that information immediately, and we were able to observe it right away. Now, this was very useful information for someone, for example, like working at the Central Bank of the US, having to decide their policy to have at the time. And since then, there have been many instances that were very similar, where our index was able to anticipate these changes in the inflation trend, which were, by the way, are very hard to forecast unless you have information of what is happening with prices in real time. And that's what our index could provide. We replicated the same methodology all over the world. We now produce inflation indices in over 20 countries on a daily basis. These are countries that have over 40% of the world population and over 75% of the world's GDP in current US dollars. And in every country where we do this, we find that we can reliably construct inflation indices that not only track the main movements of the official inflation rate, but can significantly anticipate some of these big changes that policymakers are so eager to have in real time. The fact that we did this put us at the forefront of all the discussion about big data. Big data is basically about dramatic improvement in the way we do data collection. There's a revolution on that front. And as I mentioned before, anyone can collect data now. Okay? It can be a graduate student, it can be a professor in a university, or it can be a government agency that needs to do it themselves. And this will have an impact in economics, mainly along two lines. One is what I've been discussing today, the ability that we have to improve the way we measure things in our economy. We measure our economic lives. We can improve statistics, just as we did by experimenting with all these methodologies. In the case of inflation, we can improve other statistics. Some of them we are already measuring. Some are new things that we would like to know about our economies, and we haven't yet been able to measure them correctly. But there's also another big advantage in economics, particularly in terms of economic research and academic research. Economists have had, who work in research, have had for a very long time to rely on data sets that are collected for other purposes or by governments that filter them and adjust them in certain ways. Now, these data collection techniques allow people like me and researchers around the world to go out there and collect the data we need, customized for our specific needs, and could dramatically increase the amount of valuable information we have to improve the models we make about our economies and our understanding of how our economies work. So it's a big opportunity, and at the Billion Prizes project at MIT Sloan, we're very excited about this opportunity. If there's anything that my experience with Argentina has shown me, both back then when I was a kid and recently when I had this experience with the inflation index, was that things like inflation have tremendous impact in our lives, and we have to solve them. And the first step to solving them is being able to measure them correctly and giving that information to the policymakers who have to make those decisions. And at the Billion Prizes project at MIT Sloan, we're very excited about it. We hope to continue to be at the forefront of this revolution, and we will certainly continue to work very hard at trying to achieve it. Thank you.